She really is beautiful, he muttered to the empty corridor. Terrifying presence, impossible posture, long ears too. Again, like she could hear your thoughts before you even finish thinking them, which would be inconvenient, very inconvenient. That would indeed be inconvenient. The voice came from behind him, calm, amused, and entirely real. The corridor was supposed to be empty. It began with the worst possible words spoken to the one person who was never supposed to hear them. Rowan Caldwell checked the maintenance schedule twice. Not because he trusted it, but because 18 months aboard the Citadel had taught him that palace schedules lied with the confidence of seasoned diplomats. The rosters said one thing. Reality said another. And reality in Rowan's experience was usually less polite. Still, the hour was late by orbital standards. The lighting had dimmed itself to a soft, pulsing blue, the kind the station used to encourage rest and reflection. Though Rowan had never been particularly good at either, the air carried a low vibration, a hum that lived in the bones of the station itself, constant and oddly comforting, like the breathing of something enormous and patient. If there was anyone nearby, the walls would have informed him. They had not. Rowan took this as permission to breathe. He knelt beside an access panel near the base of the inner wall. It hadn't been opened in decades, maybe longer. Its surface was etched with flowing alien glyphs, elegant symbols that rearranged themselves whenever he looked away, as if the language itself didn't want to be read by someone like him. Typical. Everything on this station had an opinion. He slipped his maintenance tool into the seam, and the panel slid open with a soft exhale, as though it had been holding its breath for years, waiting for exactly this moment. Inside, conduits pulsed with slow light. They carried energy data and things Rowan had learned not to think about too deeply. The older systems on the Citadel weren't just wiring and circuits. They were something else. Something that hummed back when you touched it. He leaned in and began working, muttering to himself as he always did. "Easy now," he said, tapping a cable that immediately recoiled as if offended. "I know you're ancient and mysterious, but we're both just trying to get through the shift without exploding." The conduit glowed a little brighter. Rowan snorted. Yeah, that's what they all say. Talking to machines was a habit he had picked up early, back when he still had a career worth talking about. Back before the incident at the Federal Space Engineering Corps that turned him from a promising systems architect into a cautionary tale whispered at orientation briefings. He had spotted a flaw in the Kepler 9 relay grid, a cascading failure waiting to happen. He reported it. No one listened. He reported it again louder. Still nothing. So he fixed it himself without authorization in the middle of a live calibration cycle. He was right. The flaw was real. His fix saved the grid and probably a few lives along the way. They fired him anyway. Insubordination, they called it. Breach of protocol. Reckless endangerment, which was a particularly creative accusation considering the alternative had been actual endangerment. Rowan had stood in a gray conference room in Houston while three men in pressed uniforms explained to him that being correct was not the same as being authorized, and that the Corps valued order above initiative. He had not argued. There was nothing to argue with. The system had spoken, and the system did not care that he was right. After that, Rowan learned something important. Being invisible was safer than being heard. So he made himself small. Took the kinds of job no one noticed, maintenance positions on stations too remote to matter, or repair shifts in corridors too deep for anyone important to walk through. He kept his head down. He talked to machines instead of people because machines didn't punish you for telling the truth. And eventually he ended up here. The Citadel, humanity's seat at the table of interstellar diplomacy, a station of impossible beauty and ancient alien engineering orbiting Earth like a cathedral suspended in starlight. And at its center, a queen. Rowan wiped his hands on his jumpsuit and stood stretching his back with a quiet groan. The corridor extended before him in sweeping, elegant curves. The walls were alive with faint constellations that shifted to match the emotional tone of whoever stood nearest. Right now they were calm, peaceful, almost intimate. Rowan sighed, the kind of sigh that slips out when you forget just for a moment where you are and how small you're supposed to be. "She really is beautiful," he muttered, barely louder than the hum of the station. He wasn't talking to anyone. He was talking the way he always talked, to the air, to the walls, to the ancient machinery that surrounded him like a second skin. "The Queen, I mean. Hard not to notice. Terrifying presence, impossible posture. Looks like she stepped out of a dream someone spent centuries perfecting. He chuckled quietly, shaking his head. Long ears, too, elegant, like she could hear your thoughts and judge them before you even finish thinking them. He paused, which would be inconvenient. Another pause. Very inconvenient. That would indeed be inconvenient. The voice came from behind him, calm, amused, and entirely real. Rowan froze. Time did something strange in that moment. It didn't stop so much as stutter. His thoughts, which had been drifting lazily along like leaves on a slow river, suddenly scattered in every direction, colliding with each other in a panic so total it felt almost spiritual. He did not turn around immediately. Some small, desperate part of his brain insisted this was a hallucination. Sleep deprivation, recycled air, a stress response brought on by loneliness and poor life choices. That hope died quickly. Slowly, painfully, like a man turning to face a firing squad, he had accidentally insulted Rowan turned. Queen Alindra stood less than a meter behind him. She was taller than him by a small and unmistakable margin. Her posture was flawless, not rigid, but composed, the kind of stillness that radiated outward and made everything around it feel slightly less significant. Her skin was smooth, nearly human in tone, but not quite, as though reality itself had made a subtle adjustment and decided to call it improvement. Her robes caught the corridor light and held it shimmering faintly with colors that had no names in any earth language. And her ears, long, graceful, unmistakably alien, they swept back from her temples in gentle curves that ended in fine tapered points. They were angled slightly backward now, which Rowan did not yet know meant amusement. He would learn. But in this moment he knew nothing except that the Queen of the Citadel was standing close enough to touch, and he had just described her ears to her face without realizing she had a face nearby to hear it. Her eyes studied him with open curiosity. Not anger, not offense. That somehow made it worse. "I can explain," Rowan said immediately. This was impressive, considering his brain had not yet caught up with his mouth and was still several seconds behind, screaming internally. "I would enjoy that," Alindra replied. Her voice was steady, layered with harmonics that no human throat could produce, warm and precise at the same time. "Please, do." Rowan swallowed. "You see, Your Majesty." "Queen, ma'am." He was already failing. This corridor was empty. I mean, not empty. It's not empty, obviously, because corridors are never truly empty, especially ones with adaptive emotional lighting and semi-sentient architecture. But empty in the sense that no one was supposed to be here, which is why I was talking to myself, not about you. He paused. "I mean, technically about you, but not to you, which would be rude. Very rude." One of her ears twitched, just slightly. "I see," she said, "and yet here I am." "Yes," Rowan said weakly. "That does appear to be the situation." Silence stretched between them. The corridor lights shifted, warming just a fraction, as if the palace itself were leaning in, curious, entertained, waiting to see what happened next. Then, to Rowan's complete and disorienting astonishment, Queen Alindra laughed. Not the polished, measured sound he had heard during broadcasts of diplomatic functions. Not the careful, controlled expression of royal amusement meant to signal approval without revealing anything real. This was a genuine laugh, soft, surprised, almost startled out of her, as though she hadn't expected it herself. It echoed faintly along the curved walls, and the constellation patterns above them flickered in response the way candlelight flickers when someone sighs. "You speak freely," she said, "for someone who believes he is alone." Rowan blinked. "That is rare here," she added. "I'm going to be honest, Your Majesty," Rowan said, because apparently his survival instincts had taken the night off. "I was expecting immediate imprisonment, or vaporization, or at the very least a very stern lecture delivered by someone with a clipboard." Her smile widened. "Disappointing, I'm sure." "A little," he admitted before he could stop himself. No, thank you for not vaporizing me." She regarded him for a moment longer. Then she stepped forward, not past him, but beside him, and Rowan became suddenly aware of how the corridor seemed to contract around her presence. Not smaller, but more focused, as though the station itself paid closer attention when she moved. "Walk with me," she said. It was not a question, but it was not entirely a command either. It lived somewhere in between, in a space Rowan did not know how to navigate. He walked. They moved through the corridor in silence at first. Rowan matched her pace with the stiff, careful steps of a man acutely aware that a single wrong movement might become historically significant in all the worst ways. The floor adjusted beneath them, smoothing its texture. The walls brightened just enough to frame their silhouettes against the shifting stars. Somewhere above, unseen systems tracked the Queen's location, recalculating security patterns, adjusting environmental parameters, and undoubtedly flagging Rowan Caldwell, maintenance technician, third class, as a walking anomaly. He resisted the urge to wave at the ceiling. "This is not a route I usually take," Alindra said, her voice conversational, almost casual, as though they were colleagues on a late evening walk, and not a queen escorting a technician who had just admired her ears behind her back. "The palace prefers predictability," she continued. Rowan nodded. "Yeah, machines like that. People too, I guess. Predictability makes everyone feel safer. Until it doesn't." She glanced at him, one long ear angled subtly in his direction. "You imply that unpredictability has value." "Oh, absolutely," Rowan said before thinking. "I mean, not always. Exploding reactors, surprise hull breaches, unexpected gravity failures, those are bad surprises. But honesty, unplanned moments, those are usually how things actually change." He winced internally. That had sounded dangerously close to philosophy. Alindra did not seem offended. If anything, she looked thoughtful, and the thoughtfulness had a weight to it, as if she were holding his words up against something inside herself and measuring the fit. "Most who speak to me measure every word," she said. "They weigh tone, implication, consequence." "I do that too," Rowan said. "I'm just terrible at it." She laughed again, quieter this time. The sound settled something in his chest that he hadn't realized was clenched. They reached a wide archway that opened onto a space so vast it made Rowan's breath catch, even though he had seen it before. The interior gardens suspended within the station's core stretched in every direction. Alien flora floated in controlled gravity pockets, their bioluminescent leaves pulsing in slow, synchronized rhythms of blue and violet and pale gold. The air here was different, richer, layered with scents that had no earthly equivalent, things that smelled like memory and distance and rain on a planet he had never visited. Rowan had been here once before. He had helped repair an environmental regulator, escorted by 3 armed guards in a hovering sentinel drone that watched him as if it expected betrayal at any moment. He had not been allowed to stop walking or look too long at anything. Now the drones dimmed as Alindra approached, recognizing her authority, and reluctantly her chosen company. "This is where I come," she said, "when the palace grows loud." She stepped into the garden. The plants drifted towards her, drawn to something, her warmth, her presence, the ancient signal in her blood that marked her as queen. Their glow intensified, painting her in soft, shifting light. "Even silence has volume," she continued, "when too many people expect things from you." Rowan stood at the edge, watching the light play across the floating gardens, watching her move through them with the ease of someone returning to the only room in a vast house that felt like home. "I fix broken conduits for a living," he said, "but I think I understand that." She stopped walking. Rowan stopped immediately, nearly bumping into her, then stepped back with a grimace. "You understand isolation," she said. "Not a question." "Yeah," he admitted. "Different scale, way less political consequence, but the feeling is familiar." Alindra turned to face him. Her gaze was sharp but not unkind. It had the quality of someone looking at a locked door and wondering whether the key might be worth the risk. "When you spoke in the corridor," she said slowly, "you called my presence terrifying." Rowan's stomach dropped through several decks. "I can clarify that." "And beautiful," she added. He closed his eyes. "I would like to formally apologize for my entire existence." Her lips curved. "You will not." He opened one eye. "I won't. No, you will continue walking with me, and you will answer my questions honestly. In return, you will not be punished for speaking a thought I have heard countless times before, but rarely without fear behind it." Rowan exhaled slowly. "That seems suspiciously reasonable." "Do not mistake reason for mercy," she said lightly. "I am simply curious." They walked deeper into the garden. The floating plants parted around them like curtains drawn back from a window. Rowan noticed how the entire environment responded to Alindra, not with obedience but with recognition, the way a forest recognizes rain. Petals opened as she passed. Leaves turned toward her like small faces following the sun. The gravity pockets shifted gently, making space deferring. He wondered not for the first time, but more sharply than before, what it would be like to carry that kind of weight everywhere you went. To walk into a room and feel it reshape itself around you. To know that every system, every sensor, every living thing in your domain was calibrated to your presence. It sounded glorious from a distance. Up close, it looked like a very beautiful prison. "You are thinking," Elindra said. "I can tell." Rowan raised an eyebrow. "You can actually hear thoughts." "No," she said, "but you breathe differently when you think. Most humans do. Your rhythms change. That is either fascinating or terrifying." "Both," she said, "usually both." They passed beneath a canopy of floating vines whose tendrils glowed a deep indigo. The light fell across them, both shifting their silhouettes into something softer, almost painterly. Rowan thought of old cathedral windows, how they turned ordinary daylight into something sacred. This place did the same thing, except the light came from living things, and the cathedral was a space station built by hands that were not human. "You know," he said, "back where I come from, they told us the Citadel was the greatest achievement of interstellar cooperation, a monument to unity, a bridge between worlds. And what do you think now that you have lived here?" "I think it is also very lonely." Elindra said nothing for several steps. The vines above them pulsed once slowly as if marking the weight of his words. "Yes," she said at last, "it is." "May I ask you something?" he said. "You may. Do you ever get tired of being impressive? I mean all the time. Every moment." Her steps slowed just a fraction. "Impressive," she repeated, as though tasting the word. "Kianan, is that how you see me?" "Among other things, mostly intimidating in a very well-designed way." Silence. "I was shaped to lead," she said at Lois. "Trained to command, expected to embody stability for an alliance that spans more worlds than your species has names for. I have held this station together through crises that would have shattered lesser structures." She paused. "It is exhausting." The word landed between them with the weight of something carried too long and set down for the first time. "Yeah," Rowan said softly. "I get tired just trying to remember where I left my tools." She smiled at that, openly, without guard. Then as quickly as it appeared, the smile faded, not into coldness but into something heavier. "I did not come to this corridor by accident tonight," she said. Rowan waited. "This evening I received a formal communication from the Alliance Council." Her voice was measured now, each word placed with care. "They have given me 30 station days to present a succession framework. If I do not, the Council will initiate oversight protocols." She let the words settle. "Do you understand what that means?" Rowan understood enough. Oversight protocols meant the Council would begin inserting their own people into Citadel operations. Monitoring, advising, gradually shifting control away from the throne until the Queen was a figurehead and the station belonged to committee. "They're putting a clock on you," he said. "Yes. And nobody here told you the truth about what that means." Her ears angled sharply. "They told me what they believed I needed to hear. Reassurances, strategies, carefully worded analyses designed to make the situation seem manageable. But it's not." "No," she said quietly, "it is not." The garden lights pulsed once slowly, as if the station itself had heard her and ached in response. "I walked tonight because I could not bear another hour of measured counsel," she said. "I walked because I wanted to move through my own station without an entourage, without protocol, without someone telling me what my next optimal decision should be." She looked at him. "And instead I found a man kneeling before a wall panel complimenting my ears to an empty corridor." Rowan rubbed the back of his neck. "Worst timing of my life, or best. Haven't decided yet." "Nor have I," she said. A second chime echoed through the garden, sharper than the first. Alindra's expression tightened. The duties she had set aside were circling back, patient as vultures. She lifted her hand, and the chime faded, but she did not dismiss it entirely this time. She let it linger at the edge of hearing, a reminder that the world beyond this garden was still waiting and would not wait forever. "I must go," she said. Rowan nodded. "Yeah, I figured the universe wouldn't leave you alone for too long." "It never does." She turned to leave, then stopped. The floating plants drifted around her, their light painting her silhouette in shifting colors, blue to gold, to something in between that had no name. Rowan Caldwell, she said without turning back. Yes, Your Majesty. You will speak of this evening to no one. Of course. And you will not apologize again for what you said in the corridor. He hesitated. Even the part about the ears, her ears angled backward. Amusement. He was beginning to learn the language of them. Especially that part, she said. Then she walked away, and the garden closed behind her, like a curtain falling on the first act of something neither of them had auditioned for. Rowan stood alone among the floating lights for a long time. The plants, no longer drawn to the Queen's presence, drifted back to their slow orbits. The ambient glow dimmed to its resting state. The garden became once again just a garden, but it didn't feel that way. He exhaled, long and slow, like a man surfacing after being underwater for longer than he realized. Then he turned and walked back through the corridors toward the lower levels, toward the small gray room that was the only space on this station that belonged to him. The walls watched him go, the lights adjusted, and somewhere deep in the architecture, a system that had been dormant for generations stirred, considered, and made a decision that would change everything. Rowan returned to his quarters at an hour so late it had circled back around to early. His room was small, utilitarian, tucked deep in the residential sectors where technicians and support staff lived in modest compartments the palace barely acknowledged existed. The walls here did not shimmer with constellations. They were gray, functional, honest in their way. He sat on the edge of his bunk and stared at the ceiling. What just happened? He asked the room. The room sensibly did not answer. He ran through the evening in his mind trying to find the moment where reality had come unhinged. The empty corridor, the muttering, the voice behind him, the walk, the garden. The queen of an interstellar alliance telling him, a maintenance worker who grew up in a small town outside Fort Collins, Colorado, that she was exhausted and alone, and that her throne was being pulled from under her by bureaucrats who measured power in paperwork. He thought about her laugh, the first one, how it had sounded like something escaping, like air rushing out of a room that had been sealed too long. He thought about the way the garden lights had moved when she walked, not following her, but welcoming her, the way a house lights up when someone comes home after a long absence. He thought about what she had said about silence having volume. Rowan had spent most of his adult life in silence. After Houston, after the firing, after the slow fade from promising engineer to invisible technician, silence had become his native language. He filled it with chatter, with jokes aimed at circuit boards, and muttered commentary no one was meant to hear. But beneath the noise, the silence was always there, wide and flat and featureless, like a desert he had learned to cross without looking up. Tonight, for the first time, someone had looked into that desert and recognized it. It didn't make sense. None of it made sense. He lay back and closed his eyes. That was when the door chimed, not his door, a door that should not have existed. On the far wall of his quarters, a seam of light appeared, tracing the outline of a passage that had not been there when he moved in. The light was warm, amber, familiar in a way he could not explain. Rowan sat up slowly. The seam widened. A panel slid aside, revealing a narrow corridor beyond, lit with the same deep amber glow. It led somewhere where he could not tell. But the air that drifted through was warm and carried a faint harmonic hum, like music heard through water. The Citadel systems were semi-sentient. Everyone knew that. They adjusted lighting temperature and gravity based on occupancy and need. They optimized traffic flow and environmental balance with quiet efficiency. They maintained themselves with the calm persistence of something that had been doing its job since before humanity learned to make fire. But they did not open new doors. They did not create passages where none existed. They did not reach out to individual people and say, in the only language they knew, come this way. This was something else entirely. Something that had rules Rowan did not understand and a purpose he could not guess. Rowan stared at the passage. "Are you talking to me?" he whispered. The light pulsed once, gently. He stood there for a long moment, heart beating against his ribs. Then he stepped back and the panels slid closed, the seam of light fading until the wall was gray and featureless again. But the warmth lingered and the hum did not quite stop. Something in the ancient bones of the Citadel had noticed Rowan Caldwell. Not his rank, not his clearance level, not the name on his personnel file or the black mark from Houston that followed him like a shadow. It had noticed him. And for the first time in a very long while, Rowan Caldwell lay awake in the dark and wondered if being invisible was still what he wanted. He was not the only one awake. 14 levels above in chambers that overlooked the slow rotation of Earth through panoramic crystalline walls, Queen Alindra stood alone. She had dismissed her attendants hours ago. The room was silent except for the low murmur of ambient systems and the faint pulse of the station's heartbeat, which she had heard every night since her coronation, and which tonight sounded different. Not louder, not faster, but more present, as if the station were paying attention to her in a way it had not in years. She stood before the window in a robe less formal than anything her advisors would have approved. Without the ceremonial layers, without the structured garments designed to project authority and control, she looked almost ordinary. Almost. Her reflection in the crystalline wall still carried the bearing, the height, the long ears that marked her lineage. You could strip away every symbol of office, and she would still look like exactly what she was. There was no version of Alindra that was not a queen. That was the problem. She replayed the evening, the technician in the corridor, his voice unguarded, muttering observations about her appearance with the casual honesty of someone who genuinely believed no one could hear, the panic on his face when he turned, the way he stumbled through sentences like a man falling down stairs but somehow landing on his feet each time. She had laughed, truly laughed. She could not remember the last time that had happened. Alindra moved to the window. Earth hung below, massive and blue, and turning with the patience of something that had seen everything and judged nothing. She placed one hand against the glass. 30 days. The council's message had been diplomatically worded, of course. Expressions of concern. Affirmations of respect. Language so carefully constructed it could mean almost anything, which meant it meant exactly one thing. They doubted her. They doubted the stability of her rule, the future of the Citadel under a queen who had no heir, no named successor, no framework for continuity. And they were not entirely wrong. She had avoided the question of succession for years, not out of negligence, but out of something harder to name. To choose a successor was to acknowledge an ending. To define what came after was to admit that after existed. And Alindra, who had spent her entire reign holding the Citadel together through crises and treaties and the slow grinding machinery of alliance politics, had never once been allowed to stop and ask herself what she wanted beyond the next emergency. She thought of her mother. The previous queen had been everything the council wanted, measured, predictable, a perfect instrument of governance who had ruled for decades without a single moment of public vulnerability. She had died in this very chamber alone, her last words directed at a diplomatic brief she had been reviewing. Not a person, a document. Alindra had been 19. She had stood beside the bed and watched the life leave her mother's eyes and understood with a clarity that felt like a blade that her mother had not lived. She had functioned, brilliantly, flawlessly, and utterly without joy. Alindra had sworn then that she would be different. She was not sure she had kept that promise. Tonight, standing in a floating garden with a human who talked to machines and complimented queens without meaning to, she had felt something shift. Not a solution, not an answer, but a crack in the wall she had built around herself, a sliver of light where none had been. She turned from the window. On her personal console, a notification pulsed. Internal security had flagged an anomaly in the lower residential sector. A brief, unexplained energy signature near the quarters of one Rowan Caldwell, maintenance technician, 3rd class. The station's ancient subsystems had activated a dormant passage node in his vicinity. The system had not done this in recorded memory. Alindra stared at the report for a long time. Then she closed it without forwarding it to anyone. "What are you doing?" she murmured, speaking not to herself but to the station, to the ancient intelligence woven into its walls and corridors and gravity wells. The lights in her chamber pulsed once, warm, amber, the same amber Rowan had seen. Alindra's ears tilted forward, attentive, alert. The Citadel was listening. For the first time in generations, it was not just maintaining. It was choosing, and the queen who had spent her life being observed by everyone found herself wondering what it meant to finally be seen. Not as a symbol, not as a title, not as the embodiment of an alliance or the keeper of a station or the answer to someone else's political equation, but as herself, whoever that was. She was not sure she knew anymore, but for the first time in longer than she cared to admit, she wanted to find out. Outside Earth continued its rotation. Inside the station hummed with something that felt almost like hope. And in the space between a queen and a technician separated by 14 levels and a lifetime of difference, a thread had formed. Thin, fragile, unannounced, but undeniably real. The summons came at a time usually reserved for sleep bad dreams and pretending that alarms were imaginary. Rowan's access band chirped sharply against his wrist, projecting a soft amber glow onto the ceiling of his quarters. He stared at it from the bunk with the blank expression of a man who had gotten exactly 2 hours of rest and was being asked to function as if that were sufficient. The projection displayed the royal seal layered over a complex web of authorization codes that Rowan had never seen directed at someone of his clearance level. Beneath the seal, a single line of text pulsed with quiet insistence. Report to Upper Palace Sector, Chamber 12. Immediately. That's never good, Rowan muttered, rolling onto his side. That's how sentences start before they end with incident report. He lay there for another moment, hoping the problem would resolve itself through denial. It did not. When he arrived at the Upper Palace Sector, 2 guards stepped aside without questioning him. That alone was unsettling. Normally, they scrutinized his credentials with the slow, deliberate suspicion of people who had been trained to assume the worst about everyone. They checked his posture, his eye movement, possibly his thoughts. Today, they simply nodded as if he belonged there. The feeling made his skin itch. He was escorted through corridors he had only seen on maintenance schematics, wide-arcing passageways, where the walls functioned as living data fields displaying star maps and diplomatic projections that shifted like slow-moving dreams. The air was different here, cleaner, weighted with importance and the faint scent of something floral that Rowan suspected cost more per molecule than his annual salary. Chamber 12 was vast, circular. The ceiling arched high overhead, displaying a real-time projection of the star field beyond the station's hull, so detailed that standing inside felt like floating in open space. Consoles rose from the floor in graceful curves, their surfaces alive with data streams that pulsed in rhythms Rowan recognized as system heartbeats. Queen Alindra stood at the center. Her hands were folded behind her back. Her long ears were angled outward in alert attention, the posture of someone listening to many things at once and trusting none of them completely. She wore formal attire today, structured and precise, every line of her silhouette engineered to communicate authority. The woman from the garden, the one who had laughed and spoken of loneliness, was folded away beneath layers of ceremony. But her eyes, when they found him, were the same. "You're early," she said, turning toward him. "You changed my schedule," Rowan replied, "and possibly my life expectancy." Her lips curved, just barely. "You exaggerate." "Statistically, I do not." Behind the queen, a figure stood in stillness, so practiced it bordered on art. Counselor Gervain was tall for his species, though not as tall as Alindra, with features that had been weathered by decades of service into something between dignity and exhaustion. His ears were shorter than the queen's, angled permanently upward in a posture that suggested perpetual vigilance. His robes were dark, unadorned, chosen to communicate function over decoration. He regarded Rowan the way a surgeon regards an unexpected object found inside a patient. Not with hostility exactly, more with a careful concern of someone who needed to understand what this was before deciding how worried to be. "Counselor Gervain," Alindra said. "This is the technician I mentioned." Gervain inclined his head. "Rowan Caldwell, Maintenance Division, 3rd class." He recited the facts without inflection, but each one landed like a small, polite stone placed on a scale. Formerly of the Federal Space Engineering Corps, separated under disciplinary action. Rowan kept his face neutral. "You read my file." "I read everyone's file," Gervain said. "It is my function." "I require his assistance," Alindra said. The word require carried weight. It was not a request, and it was not directed at Rowan. It was directed at Gervain, at the institution he represented, at every protocol that said a maintenance technician had no business standing in this chamber. Gervain's ears shifted, a micro-movement barely perceptible, but Rowan was learning to read these signals. Concern, restraint, the desire to speak weighed against the knowledge that speaking would change nothing. "Of course, Your Majesty," Gervain said. Alindra gestured toward a console that rose smoothly from the floor, its surface blooming with data. "Officially," she said, "you are here to examine the subsystems beneath the throne sector. An ancient network that has begun behaving unpredictably. Rowan approached the console. The data was dense layered, written in a hybrid language that was part engineering notation and part something older, something that predated the Alliance by centuries. He leaned in squinting, and unofficially he asked. Elindra's gaze held steady. I wish to observe how you work. You solve problems differently than my engineers. He raised an eyebrow. I swear a lot more. That has been noted. Gervain remained near the chamber entrance watching, not interfering, not leaving, present in the way that a conscience is present, quiet and impossible to ignore. The console displayed a tangled lattice of energy flows running beneath the throne sector. The system was ancient, far older than Elindra's reign, older than her mother's older, perhaps than the recorded history of the Citadel itself. And it was behaving strangely. Power was rerouting through channels that hadn't been active in centuries. Data streams were looping back on themselves. The Palace AI had flagged the behavior as anomalous, but could not explain it, which meant the anomaly predated the AI's own understanding. Rowan studied the patterns. His fingers moved across the interface, coaxing data into simpler forms, stripping away layers of administrative overlay until the raw signals were visible beneath. Oh, he said, that's charming. You sound displeased, Elendra said. No, he said quickly. This system is just very confident it knows better than everyone else. Like a retired admiral with opinions about everything. He talked as he worked. He always did. The habit that had gotten him into trouble in the corridor now served a different purpose here, narrating his thoughts so that Elendra could follow his reasoning without interrupting it. If I were a 1,000-year-old gravity stabilizer, he said, I'd also be grumpy about new software updates. Look at this. See how it reroutes when it thinks it's being ignored. That's not a malfunction. That's spite. One of Elendra's ears twitched. You assign emotions to machines. Only the stubborn ones. He adjusted the flow parameters carefully. Not forcing correction, but easing the load, redirecting energy the way you'd redirect water, not by building a dam, but by offering a gentler path. The chamber lights flickered once, then stabilized. The system responded with a low harmonic resonance that vibrated through the floor, a sound that felt less like machinery and more like satisfaction. There, Rowan said, appeased, for now. Elendra studied the steady data streams. My engineers attempted to overwrite it. Rowan winced. Yeah, that would just make it angrier. She looked at him with an expression he could not fully read. You speak of systems as if they listen. They do, he said, just not the way we expect. A system this old has been talked at for centuries. Overwritten, patched, commanded. Nobody ever stopped to ask what it was trying to say. That's the difference between fixing something and actually understanding it. He straightened, wiping his hands on his jumpsuit. The gesture was automatic, the habit of a man who had spent years in places where no one watched his manners. It's the same with people, honestly, he added, but people are harder to reboot. Silence followed, comfortable this time, the kind that settles between two people who have said enough for the moment and are content to let the quiet hold what words cannot. Gervain stepped forward. Your Majesty, the morning session begins in 40 minutes. Elendra acknowledged him with a slight nod, but did not move immediately. She was still watching the data streams, watching the ancient system breathe in its new equilibrium, and Rowan had the sense that she was seeing something in those patterns that went beyond engineering. Counselor, she said without turning, has this system ever been examined by someone outside the Royal Engineering Corps? No, Your Majesty. Protocol restricts access to cleared personnel with a minimum classification of. I am aware of the protocol, she said. I wrote half of it. She paused. I am asking whether it has ever been questioned. Gervain was quiet for a moment. No, he said, it has not. Elendra turned from the console. Then perhaps it should be. She left the chamber without looking back. Gervain followed, but at the doorway he paused and glanced at Rowan. The look was brief, unreadable, but it carried the weight of a man who had served the throne for longer than Rowan had been alive, and who recognized with something between admiration and dread that the ground beneath him was shifting. Then he was gone, and Rowan stood alone in Chamber 12, surrounded by star maps and the quiet hum of a system that for the first time in centuries seemed almost content. Over the next 2 days, Rowan was summoned 3 more times. Each visit followed the same pattern. An official reason, system diagnostics, environmental calibration, power grid analysis, and an unofficial reality that neither of them named aloud. Elendra watched him work. She asked questions. She listened. And in the spaces between technical discussion, something else grew. A familiarity, a rhythm. The careful, tentative architecture of trust being built by two people who had both learned in very different ways that trust was expensive and usually disappointing. On the second visit, Rowan was deep inside a maintenance shaft when the tremor hit. It started as a vibration in his palms, a wrongness in the frequency of the metal beneath his hands. Then the shaft shuddered. The light stuttered. A sound rose from somewhere far below. Not mechanical, but almost organic. A groan that resonated through the station's bones, like the voice of something ancient and in pain. Rowan pulled himself out of the shaft and found Alindra already in the chamber. Her composure intact, but her ears angled sharply backward. Concern, carefully contained. The gravity core beneath the throne sector is desynchronizing, she said. Rowan stared at the holographic projection that filled the center of the room. The display was at unstable segments, flickering in and out of alignment colors, stuttering, as predictive models failed to converge. The patterns were wrong, feedback loops spiraling inward, energy bleeding into channels that hadn't been active in centuries. Ancient architecture arguing with newer systems about how reality should behave. That's not supposed to happen, he said. No, she agreed. It is not. Advisors had gathered at the chamber's edge, their voices low and urgent. Gervain stood among them, his expression grave. Rowan could feel the weight of their attention, the skepticism, the quiet outrage that a human technician was standing where their best engineers should be. He ignored them. He had been ignored by better. This core wasn't designed for constant ceremonial load, he said, speaking to Elindra, but loud enough for the room. Throne events, diplomatic gatherings, large-scale energy displays. It's been compensating by pulling from secondary systems. And those secondary systems are old. How old? Elindra asked. Rowan swallowed. Older than the Palace AI, possibly older than recorded history, which means they don't like being rushed, and they really don't like being overwritten. He paused, looking at the data with new eyes. The system wasn't just malfunctioning, it was exhausted. It had been carrying the weight of the entire throne sector for generations, absorbing the demands of ceremony and governance and spectacle, compensating and adapting and enduring. And no one in all that time had stopped to ask it how it was doing. No one had listened. The parallel was not lost on him. A low tremor rippled through the chamber. The hologram warped, then stabilized. The advisors shifted uneasily. Can you stabilize it? Elindra asked. Her voice was steady, but her ears had not moved from their backward angle. She was afraid. She was hiding it beautifully, but she was afraid. Yes, Rowan said immediately. Then he hesitated. Probably. An advisor hissed something in a language Rowan's translator couldn't parse. Elindra's gaze did not leave his face. What do you need? He took a breath. Access, full access to the deep architecture. And time. She considered this for less than a second. Granted. The advisors erupted in sharp, overlapping objections. Gervain raised a hand, quieting them, but his own expression was troubled. Your Majesty, he said carefully, this system is the foundation of the throne sector, granting unrestricted access to the only person on this station who has successfully communicated with it. Alindra finished. Yes, Counselor, I am aware of what I am doing. Gervain held her gaze for a long moment. Then he stepped back, not in agreement but in deference. There was a difference, and everyone in the room felt it. Rowan exhaled. Okay, let's go talk to something older than civilization. No pressure. They descended together. The path opened ahead of them as emergency protocols rerouted traffic. The deeper they went, the older the architecture became. Smooth curves gave way to massive carved structures that seemed grown rather than built, their surfaces textured with patterns that shifted in the peripheral vision and held still when observed directly. The air vibrated with restrained power, thick and warm, like standing inside the chest of something breathing. Rowan knelt beside an interface that didn't recognize his credentials so much as tolerate his presence. He placed his hands on the surface and felt the hum beneath his palms, and deeper, here slower like a heartbeat that had been beating since before his species learned to walk upright. Hey, he murmured, I know you're tired. I would be too. But if you collapse everything above, you goes too. And that's a lot of paperwork for everybody. The core pulsed, erratic, angry, hurt. Alindra stood behind him watching. Her presence was steady grounding, a fixed point in a room full of instability. "You speak to it as if it understands," she said. "It does," Rowan said. "Just not language. It understands intent, approach, whether you're here to command it or to listen to it." He adjusted the flow carefully, the way you'd ease a knot from a muscle that had been clenched for years. Not forcing, coaxing, acknowledging the tension before trying to release it. Sweat beaded at his temples. "Your engineers tried to override it," he said, not accusingly. "They treated it like faulty code. But it's not code, it's more like memory. Like the station remembers something and nobody ever asked what." The core pulsed again, slower this time. The tremors eased. Then without warning, the interface beneath Rowan's hands flared with light. Not the amber of the station's standard systems. Something deeper, older. A color that existed at the edge of perception, felt more than seen. Images flickered through the chamber, not holograms, something older. Fragments of light that carried emotion rather than information, shapes that dissolved before they could be understood. Voices speaking in a language that existed before language was invented. Rowan caught glimpses, a civilization building something vast, hands placing a light at the center of a structure, a figure standing where he knelt now, but nothing held. Everything slipped away like a dream collapsing at the edges. He sat back, breathing hard. His hands were trembling. "What was that?" he whispered. Alindra had not moved, but her face had changed. The composure, the mask, the carefully engineered expression of royal control, all of it had cracked. Not broken, cracked. And through the cracks, something raw and real looked out. She stepped forward slowly and placed her own hand on the interface. The surface warmed beneath her touch. The core pulsed once strongly, and the harmonic resonance shifted. Rose reached toward her like a hand extended across an impossible distance. Then it pulled back. The light faded. The resonance dimmed to a low, steady hum. Whatever the core had tried to show them, whatever it had tried to say, it was not ready, or they were not. "It knows me," Alindra said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But it is not finished. There is something deeper, something it needs me to see." She withdrew her hand. The interface cooled. The core settled into an uneasy stability, like a conversation interrupted mid-sentence. "The Citadel is not just a station," she said. "It carries something. I do not yet know what, but I intend to find out." Rowan looked at the data streams now flowing smoothly, still ancient but no longer angry. The system had not been malfunctioning. It had been grieving. Generations of queens had ruled from above, issuing commands through layers of technology and protocol, and none of them had come down here. None of them had touched the core. None of them had listened. "It was waiting," he said. Alindra closed her eyes, her ears angled forward, attentive open, in the posture of someone listening to something they had never heard before and recognizing it instantly. "Yes," she said, "it was." The core stabilized, not with the grudging compliance of a system forced into order, but with the deep, resonant calm of something finally acknowledged. The tremors ceased. The power flows steadied. The chamber lights bloomed warm and golden, brighter than they had been in living memory. Dravane appeared at the entrance. He took one look at the chamber, at the queen with her hand on the ancient interface, at the human technician, sitting on the floor with trembling hands and an expression of bewildered awe, and he stopped. For a long moment, the counselor said nothing. Then very quietly he said, "The delegation arrives tomorrow." Alindra opened her eyes. The vulnerability vanished, folded away with the speed and precision of someone who had practiced hiding for a lifetime. She straightened. Her ears shifted to their formal position. The queen returned, but Rowan had seen, and he knew with a certainty that went beyond logic that what had just happened in this chamber could not be folded away forever. Something had awakened, in the station, in her, and the delegation that was coming would test whether she had the courage to let it stay awake. The delegation chamber had been designed to impress species that measured power in spectacle. Vast arcs of light curved overhead, forming slow-moving constellations that shifted to mirror the political balance of the room. Gravity was tuned to a perfect, neutral, and calibrated, so that no representative felt taller or smaller than any other, which Rowan thought was either brilliant diplomacy or a recipe for everyone to feel equally uncomfortable. The floor was polished to a reflective sheen that caught the starlight from above and threw it back upward, so that standing in the chamber felt like standing between two skies. Rowan stood exactly where Queen Alindra had instructed him to stand, half a step behind her, slightly to her right, close enough to be visible, far enough to be unmistakably out of place. He was aware of this. Everyone was aware of this. Several representatives glanced at him as they entered, then at each other. One of them, a crystalline figure whose body refracted light like a living chandelier, frowned in a way that suggested Rowan was either a bold political statement or a clerical error. Rowan smiled politely. He had learned that smiling confused most non-humans. It bought time. And time in rooms like this was the only currency a maintenance technician could spend. Alindra spoke with calm authority, her voice carrying effortlessly through the chamber without amplification. She negotiated redirected, dismantled objections with a precision that bordered on art. Every sentence was engineered. Every pause was deliberate. She moved through the diplomatic landscape the way a surgeon moves through an operation, aware of every nerve, every vessel, every consequence of cutting too deep or not deep enough. Rowan listened, not to the politics which were dense and layered with implications he could not fully parse, but to her, to the quest of what she was doing. He could hear it now, the micro-hesitations, the slight tightening of her voice when a question came too close to something real. He could see it in her ears held in rigid formal position, angled neither forward nor back, the posture of someone who was feeling everything and showing nothing. He understood now what it cost her to be this composed, how much of herself was folded away to maintain the image they expected. How many years she had spent perfecting the architecture of control building walls, so elegant that no one thought to ask what they were hiding. The session continued for hours. Trade agreements, security protocols, resource allocations. The machinery of interstellar governance grinding forward with the slow, relentless patience of something that had no concept of exhaustion. Then near the end, the crystalline representative spoke. "Your Majesty." Its voice resonated like struck glass, sharp and beautiful, and designed to carry. "Your court grows unconventional." The chamber shifted. Attention that had been distributed across dozens of conversations collapsed to a single point. Every eye, every sensor, every consciousness in the room focused on the space between the representative and the queen. Alindra did not look at Rowan. "Progress often does," she replied. The representative was not finished. "The council has noted recent instabilities within the Citadel's core infrastructure. Anomalous energy patterns. System behaviors that defy prediction. There are those who suggest these irregularities reflect a broader instability." The word hung in the air. Instability, aimed at the station, meant for the queen. "There are those," the representative continued, its crystalline facets catching the light in sharp, deliberate angles, "who question whether the current governance framework is equipped to address the challenges ahead, particularly given the absence of a succession plan." Silence, the kind that has mass and pressure. Behind Alindra, Rowan felt his chest tighten. He could see the trap. The representative was not asking a question. It was building a case, laying stones one by one across a path that led to a single destination. Oversight, intervention. The slow, polite dismantling of everything Alindra had built. He watched her shoulders. They did not move. Her hands, folded behind her back, did not tremble. Her ears held their position with mechanical precision. But he knew. He had seen her in the garden. He had seen her at the core. He knew what the stillness cost. Dravane stepped forward from his position near the chamber wall. His movement was subtle, practiced the motion of a man who had spent decades placing himself between the queen and danger. He leaned close to Alindra, his voice pitched low enough that only she and Rowan could hear. "Your Majesty, a measured response would serve well here. The delegation seeks reassurance. If we address the succession question in private session, we can control the narrative." He paused. "And it may be advisable to reconsider Mr. Caldwell's presence at future proceedings. His position invites questions that complicate our message." Rowan heard every word. He kept his face neutral. He had practice at that. Years of practice standing in rooms where people discussed him as if he were a piece of furniture that someone had placed in the wrong corner. Alindra was still for a long moment. The chamber waited. The constellations overhead slowed their rotation as if the room itself were holding its breath. Then she did something that no one expected. She stepped forward. not toward the crystalline representative, not toward Dravain, forward into the open center of the chamber where the light was brightest and the gravity was most precisely neutral and every eye had nowhere else to look. "You speak of instability," she said. Her voice was different now, not louder but stripped of something. The diplomatic veneer, the careful modulation, the engineered precision. What remained was rawer, clearer. "True. You are correct." A ripple moved through the chamber. Representatives exchanged glances. Advisors stiffened. Dravain's ears angled sharply, a reaction he could not suppress. "The Citadel's core systems are ancient," Alindra continued, "older than this alliance, older than the recorded history of most species in this room. They have sustained this station for millennia, and they are weakening. Not because of negligence, not because of mismanagement, but because for generations those who ruled from above failed to understand what lay beneath." She let the words settle. "I include myself in that failure." The silence that followed was absolute. Rowan had never heard a room of that many beings produce so little sound. Even the ambient systems seemed to dim as if the station were listening. "I have spent my reign maintaining an image of control," Elindra said. "I have spoken the words my advisors crafted. I have worn the composure my station demands. I have answered your questions with the answers you expected, and I have done it well." She paused. "But I have not been honest. And that dishonesty has cost us more than any technical failure." She turned slowly, her gaze sweeping the room. When it passed over Rowan, it held for just a moment, not seeking permission, not asking for support, simply acknowledging that he was there and that his presence meant something she was no longer willing to hide. "This man," she said, "is a maintenance technician, third class. He has no diplomatic clearance, no political standing, and no reason to be in this chamber except that I asked him to be here. He is here because he is the only person on this station who understood what was wrong with our oldest systems, not because he has superior knowledge, but because he listened. He approached the core not with commands, but with patience, and the core responded in ways it has not responded in generations." She straightened to her full height. The light caught her differently now, not the engineered brilliance of a political stage, but something simpler and more powerful. "I do not have a succession plan," she said. "I do not have a framework for continuity. What I have is a station that is aligned in ways we have forgotten, a core that carries the consciousness of my ancestor, and the beginning of an understanding that governance built on image alone will always eventually crack." She looked at the crystalline representative directly. "You asked whether I am equipped to lead. I am telling you honestly that I do not know, but I am telling you the truth, and I believe that is worth more than another generation of measured answers." The chamber remained silent for a long time after she finished. The constellations overhead had stopped moving entirely. The gravity felt different, not heavier, but more present, as if the room itself had taken on the weight of what had been said. The crystalline representative's facets shifted. Colors moved through its body in patterns Rowan could not interpret. Then it spoke. That it said, in the first honest thing a sitting monarch has said in this chamber in 112 years. It was not approval, not exactly, but it was something rarer. Respect earned not through performance, but through vulnerability. The session ended. The representatives filed out in clusters, their conversations quieter than when they had arrived. Their postures subtly changed. Something had shifted in the room, and they were carrying it with them, processing it, turning it over. Dravain was the last to leave. He stood near the entrance, watching Alindra with an expression Rowan had not seen on his face before. Not disapproval, not concern. Something closer to recognition, as if he were seeing someone he had known for decades and realizing for the first time that he had never actually seen them at all. He did not speak. He simply bowed deeper than protocol required and left. The aftermath was not gentle. By the next cycle, the palace had opinions. Factions that had quietly supported Alindra's reign began distancing themselves, issuing carefully worded statements that praised her courage while questioning her judgment. Allied representatives sent private communiques requesting clarification. Two minor delegations recalled their ambassadors for consultation, which was diplomatic language, for we need to decide how worried to be. Alindra absorbed it all with the stillness of someone who had expected the blow and chosen to stand for it anyway. Rowan saw her once briefly in a corridor between sessions. She was surrounded by aides, her posture impeccable, her voice steady. But when her gaze found his across the crowded passage, something passed between them that had no name and needed none. He nodded. She did not nod back, but her ears shifted just slightly forward, toward him. It was enough. On the evening of the sixth day, Dravain found Alindra in the suspended garden. She was alone, standing among the floating plants, their bioluminescent glow painting her in shifting light. She looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. He approached slowly, without ceremony. "Your Majesty." "Counselor." He stood beside her for a long moment, watching the plants drift. The silence between them was layered with decades of shared history, shared crises, shared burdens, carried in parallel, but never truly together. "I owe you an apology," he said. Elindra's ears shifted, surprise. She hit it quickly, but not quickly enough. "I have served the throne for 37 years. Dravain continued. "I served your mother before you. I have dedicated my life to protecting the stability of this station and the image of its queen." He paused, and in doing so I failed to ask whether the queen I was protecting was the queen who actually existed. Alindra said nothing. The plants drifted. "I built a version of you," he said, "polished, precise, unassailable. I built it because I believed it would keep you safe. I built it because your mother taught me that safety lay in control, and I never questioned that teaching." He turned to face her. "I should have. I should have asked you what you needed instead of telling you what you should be. And I am sorry." The words settled into the garden like stones dropped into still water. Ripples moved outward, invisible but felt. Alindra was quiet for a long time. When she spoke, her voice was softer than Rowan had ever heard it. "You did what you believed was right," she said. "And for many years it was right. Or at least it was necessary." "But not anymore," Dravain said. "No," she said, "not anymore." He nodded, slowly. The nod of a man setting down something he had carried for decades and feeling for the first time the ache in his shoulders where the weight had been. "The core is destabilizing again," he said quietly. "Worse than before." Alindra closed her eyes. "I know. The engineers cannot reach it. It responds only to Caldwell, and even he says it needs something more." "I know that too." "Then you know what must be done." She opened her eyes. In the bioluminescent light, they shone with something fierce and frightened and unbreakably alive. "Yes," she said, "I do." They descended to the deepest level of the citadel. Rowan and Alindra, together with Dravain's blessing and no escort. The counselor had argued briefly for a security detail, then stopped. He understood. Some doors could only be opened by those willing to walk through them alone. The architecture here was primordial. Walls of dark living stone that pulsed with veins of light so faint they seemed imagined. The air was thick with harmonic resonance, layers of sound that overlapped and intertwined until they became something felt rather than heard. The gravity was heavier, not oppressively so, but with the dense, deliberate weight of a place that remembered everything and forgave nothing. Rowan's hands were steady. His breathing was not. The corridor they walked through pulsed with the same amber light he had seen that first night when the station had opened a door in his quarters that should not have existed. He understood now. It had been leading him here. All along it had been leading him here. The core chamber opened before them like the inside of a cathedral built by gods who had forgotten how to be small. The ceiling was lost in darkness. The floor was smooth and warm, alive with slow-moving patterns of light that responded to their footsteps. At the center, the core itself pulsed with a rhythm that was unmistakably organic, a heartbeat ancient and vast and terribly achingly tired. Rowan knelt beside the interface. The surface recognized him now, not his credentials. Him. It warmed beneath his hands like skin greeting skin. "Hey," he said softly. "It's me again, and I brought someone." The core pulsed, uneven, wary. Alindra stepped forward. She stood at the edge of the interface, looking down at the patterns of light that swirled beneath the surface. Her reflection stared back at her from the polished stone, a queen framed by the glow of something that had been waiting for her longer than she had been alive. "I don't know what to say," she said quietly. To the core, to Rowan, to herself. "You don't have to say anything," Rowan said. "Just listen." She knelt. The motion was graceful, instinctive, and utterly without ceremony. a queen kneeling before the heart of her own station. Not in submission, in connection. She placed her hands on the interface. The response was immediate. Light erupted from the core, not violent, not blinding, but immense. It filled the chamber like sunrise fills a valley, flooding every surface with warmth and color that had no names in any language Rowan knew. The harmonic resonance deepened, expanded, became a chord that vibrated through his bones and his blood, and something deeper than both. And then the memories came. Not fragments this time, not echoes. The full weight of them pouring through Alindra's hands and into her mind with the force of a river breaking through a dam that had held for 1,000 years. She saw the first queen, not as a figure in ancient records, not as a name carved into ceremonial walls. She saw her as a person, tall, luminous, with ears longer than Alindra's own, and eyes that carried the same exhaustion, the same loneliness, the same desperate love for a station she had built to endure beyond her. The first queen had stood in this very chamber in the final hours of her life, and she had pressed her consciousness into the core. Not as data, not as code, as herself. Her memories, her fears, her hope that someday someone would come back down here and listen. And Alindra saw what came after. Generation after generation of queens who ruled from above, who maintained the image, who perfected the ceremony, who built layers of protocol and governance over the living heart of the station and never once descended to touch it. Each generation a little more distant, each reign a little more controlled, each queen a little more alone. The pattern was clear, devastating, familiar. Her mother had been the last, brilliant, flawless, and utterly disconnected. She had ruled from a throne built over a heart she never knew was beating. She had died alone because she had been taught that alone was what queens were supposed to be. Alindra felt the tears before she knew she was crying. They fell onto the interface and the surface absorbed them, and the core pulsed in response, not with grief, but with relief, recognition, the ache of finally being found. "I see you," Alindra whispered. "I see all of you." The light shifted, warmed. The harmonic resonance settled into a steady, deep tone that vibrated through the entire station. Far above, in corridors and chambers and diplomatic halls, lights brightened. Systems that had been sluggish for years hummed with renewed energy. The Citadel breathed fully and deeply for the first time in generations. Rowan watched from where he knelt, his hands still on the interface, his heart beating in rhythm with the core. He did not speak. There was nothing to say. This moment belonged to Alindra and to the ancestor who had waited 1,000 years for someone to come home. They emerged from the deep levels in silence. The corridors responded to them differently now. The light was warmer. The walls displayed constellations that were brighter, sharper, more alive. The ambient hum had changed, not louder, but richer, layered with harmonics that had been dormant for centuries. The station felt like a different place. Or perhaps it felt for the first time like itself. Gervain was waiting at the entrance to the upper levels. He took one look at Alindra's face and whatever he had been planning to say dissolved. He simply stepped aside and let them pass. They walked through the palace toward a corridor that Rowan recognized. The same corridor where it had all begun. The same soft blue lighting. The same gentle hum. The same curved walls with their shifting constellations, though the constellations were different now, brighter, as if the stars themselves had been polished. Alindra stopped. Rowan stopped beside her. "I have made a decision," she said. Rowan's stomach tightened. That sentence usually comes with paperwork. Her lips curved. The smile was tired but real, more real than anything he had seen from her in a chamber full of diplomats. "You will be offered a permanent position," she said. "Cultural liaison, technical advisor. Officially, you will bridge human and royal systems. And unofficially," her ears angled forward, attentive, honest, open in a way that would have been unthinkable a week ago. "You will remind me who I am," she said, "when the palace tries to make me forget." Rowan let out a slow breath. "You know that means I'll keep talking right to machines, to corridors, to you probably at inconvenient times." "I am counting on it." He laughed, genuinely. The sound echoed down the corridor, and the walls responded, their constellations flickering warmly as if pleased. "You've changed," he said. "So have you," she replied. You no longer hide behind humor alone. He considered that it was true. He still joked, still deflected, but he no longer used it to disappear. Somewhere between the garden and the core, between the first awkward confession and this quiet corridor, he had stepped out of the desert of invisibility and found that being seen, while terrifying, was also the only thing that had ever made him feel real. I used to think surviving meant staying invisible, he said. Turns out being seen isn't the worst thing. Alindra studied him. Her expression was no longer guarded. The walls she had spent a lifetime building were not gone. They would never be entirely gone, but they had doors now, and some of those doors were open. Speak, she said softly. Rowan hesitated. Then he smiled. The crooked, tired, honest smile of a man who had learned late and painfully that the truth was worth the risk. The queen really is beautiful, he said, but not because she's perfect, because she listens. Elindra laughed. Open and unrestrained, a sound that filled the corridor and traveled outward through the living walls of the station, through conduits and corridors and ancient chambers, through the deep core where 1,000-year-old consciousness stirred and recognized, with something that felt almost like joy, the sound of its descendant finally free. The palace lights warmed in response. Every constellation on every wall throughout the citadel brightened just a fraction, as if the station itself were exhaling after holding its breath for longer than anyone could remember. They stood there for a moment, two figures in a quiet corridor, no longer separated by rank or species or the careful architecture of fear. The hum of the station surrounded them, steady and deep, the heartbeat of something ancient and alive, and at last at peace. Then Aelindra turned, and the corridor opened before her, and Rowan walked beside her. Not behind, not a step to the right, beside. And beyond the walls, the citadel continued its endless orbit around the blue planet below, stable and balanced, and quietly, profoundly changed. Its systems hummed with renewed purpose. Its corridors glowed with warmth that had been dormant for generations. Its ancient core beat steadily, no longer grieving, no longer waiting, finally connected to the living world above. And Rowan Caldwell, once a man who spoke only to machines because machines were safer than people, walked forward into a future where his voice mattered, where the truth he had carried in silence for years had found, against all probability, the one person in the universe who needed to hear it. Not a queen who demanded perfection, a woman who had chosen at last to be real.